like first to express my thanks to this entire network and the responsibles of it for this invitation and for this opportunity to present this lecture here today in this inspiring place. I would also like to apologize for a slight change in the title of my presentation. As you can see, and as you know from the program, the title, the focus of my presentation today is on risk perceptions and how these impact on risk management, and especially ecological risk management. And I initially intended to focus on two cases of risks, forest fire risk and drought risk, but later on, finally, I changed up my mind for a series of reasons, data availability, time availability, and so on. So I'm focusing on two case studies on drought risk, only on drought risk. Now, a few words about the structure of this presentation. It includes two parts, a theoretical one on risk perceptions and an empirical. The second part is an empirical one, which includes, of course, the two case studies. The first case study comes from mainland Greece. The second refers to insular regions of Greece. So, the theoretical part of this presentation, I could say that it is divided in three sections. The first is about risk perception definitions. What is risk perception? Meanings and related concepts. The second concentrates on the factors that affect risk perception and ways of measurement. And the third section focuses on the major findings of the basic, let's say, epistemological approaches to risk perception. So, first, what is risk perception? I could say in simple words that risk perception is the subjective judgment that people make about the characteristics and severity of a risk. The term is most commonly used in cases of natural hazards and threats to the environment and health. This concept arose out of the observation that experts on the one hand and lay people on the other do not agree about the severity of risk coming from new technologies, development processes, economic activities, natural hazards, and so on. Now, there is a diagram in this slide depicting exactly these big differences between objective risks, let's say, on the one hand, or the risks of scientists and experts, and risk perceptions on the other. So there is a dividing line in the middle of this diagram, and below the line you can see these circles that represent actual risk or objective risk as estimated by scientists, basically on the basis of probability of the occurrence of a catastrophic or damaging event. And above the line, you can see the circles that represent risk perceptions, or in other words, public attention on risk, or public outrage caused by risk. And you can probably notice several cases where this difference is very large and very impressive. For instance, take the case of terrorism, and you can see that while the objective risk of terrorism, in terms of the probability of occurrence of such an event, while this probability is very low, on the other hand, public attention to terrorism and public perceptions about terrorism are very large. In contrast, there are other risk cases, for instance, drought risk or heat wave or forest fire risk, where while the objective risk, the probabilities for occurrence in specific time horizons are very high, public attention to these risks is very low. And the query that is automatically raised is, why does this happen? And I hope that in the course of this presentation, you will get some sort of answers. Risk perception is connected to another important, let's say, concept, which is acceptable risk by a group or community. Acceptable risk denotes how much risk-taking can a society be, on the one hand, or how much a society is willing to pay for its protection against risk. Several authors and scholars, among them Starr, already since 1969, found that people accept risks 1,000 times greater if they are involuntary, rather than if they are involuntary. Here in this slide, I have put two images from depicting devotees, worshippers, taking holy bath in the river Ganges in India. And I have put these images here to show you how low the risk perception of these devotees are as regards threat to their health. Because, as you already know, Ganges is worshipped and is worshipped as a god and Bato Ganges, but at the same time it suffers from high levels of pollution. So it carries important, significant threats to health. But the perceptions, the risk perceptions of those taking holy baths there are very low regarding the risk they are running as regards their health. So again, the query that is raised is, why does this happen? So I'm moving now to the section about the factors that influence risk perceptions and ways of measurement. Early attempts to measure risk perception were based on the assumption that individuals behave in a rational manner, meaning that they exaggerate fears or do not care about risks or ignore or bypass risks just because they don't have inadequate, appropriate risk information. But recent studies have found that additional risk information alone does not change risk perceptions. So, in order to address this problem, three approaches have been built to risk perception. These approaches constitute attempts to identify the factors that influence risk perception and also to measure the impact of these factors on this attribute of risk perception. So we have the psychological approach, which focuses on research about how people process risk information. We have, secondly, the anthropological, sociological approach, which is based on the assumption that risk perceptions are socially constructed by institutions cultural values and ways of life. And we have, thirdly, interdisciplinary approach, which attempted to combine research on psychology, anthropology, sociology, and communication theory. And this interdisciplinary approach somehow culminated with what is called SARF. SARF is the abbreviated name. It means Social Amplification of Risk Framework. Now, which are the findings, the major findings of these approaches to risk perception? First, the findings of the psychological approach. This approach elevated what is called cognitive heuristics in solving and simplifying the risk information. According to this approach, these heuristics lead to biases in risk comprehension. And in order to explain what these heuristics and biases are, I decided that the best way is to put some examples. So, for instance, we have the conservatism bias, according to which people tend to believe prior evidence more than new that emerges. For instance, people were slow to accept that the earth was round. They tended rather to believe that it was flat because of prior evidence. There is this Austric effect, you already know, the choice supportive bias, another form of bias, which means thinking positive things about our choices. When we have made these choices, despite the fact that they could have disadvantages, problems. Another important findings of the cognitive psychology and the psychometric paradigm are first that the majority of people tend to have concern about the risks of their everyday life, the immediate risks they are confronting, they are faced with, rather than long-term risks and problems like the hazards originating from climate change. Another finding was that all things being equal, the greater people perceive a benefit from a risk, the greater tolerance they exhibit toward this risk. And in general, high-order factors that influence risk perception are first, the degree to which risk is understood, the degree to which it evokes specific feelings like the feeling of dread, and the number of people exposed. Now, I'm moving now to the anthropological and sociological approach. This culminated with the cultural theory of risk, pioneered by the anthropologist Mary Douglas and the political scientist Aaron Vidalski. And this approach contradicts the paradigm of of rational choice of the individual. The specific theory indicates 4 ways of life, or 4 social structures: the hierarchical, the individualistic, the egalitarian, and the fatalist. And these, let's say, 4 categories imply particular outlooks on risk. These 4 categories of social structures, you can see them on the diagram below, and have resulted out of markings, let's say, along 2 dimensions: the horizontal dimension, which is the group dimension, and the vertical one, which is the grid dimension. Grid categorizes the degree to which people are circumscribed in their social role, while group refers to the extent to which individuals are bounded by feelings of solidarity. There have been some attempts to combine the psychometric paradigm with the cultural theory of risk, and the result has been the cultural cognition approach. And on the basis of this approach, there have been some risk surveys which found that the person's worldview on the two social and cultural dimensions of hierarchy, egalitarianism on the one hand, and individualism, solidarity on the other, were predictive somehow of the response to risk. And now to the social amplification of risk framework, this interdisciplinary approach, which makes a step forward as it outlines the fact that risk perceptions are actually amplified or attenuated versions of real risks. And this is happening because in the route from the sender to the receiver of the risk information, there are some stops where risk is attenuated. For instance, the mass media, rumors, and so on. Some stops where risk information is, let's say, exaggerated or amplified. And so the final result is amplified and attenuated versions of real risk as risk perceptions. What is important with SARF also is that it suggested that these amplified and attenuated versions of risk perception generate behaviors which in turn have secondary social and economic impacts and have a very important impact on the physical, on the real risk itself. And these are called ripple effects. And now I'm moving to the empirical part with the two case studies, but I would like first to refer to some theoretical issues concerning drought. What does drought mean? Drought actually has several facets or aspects. We have first the meteorological drought, meaning in simple word, reduced precipitation. We have the hydrological drought version, which is actually the impact of reduced precipitation on the surface runoff and underground drainage. This hydrological drought is manifested by means of reduction of soil moisture, river flow, spring supply, reduction of water level of lakes, reservoirs, and underground water resources. Furthermore, we have the agricultural drought, meaning the impact of reduced water supply on crops and on agricultural products. And we have ecological drought, meaning the impact of reduced water on ecosystems. And finally, we have socioeconomic drought, which occurs when water demand exceeds water supply and water shortage become perceptible by the society. This socioeconomic drought case connects the reduction of water availability due to natural causes with offer and demand of water-related goods and services, such as potable water, hydroelectric power, and so on. So, now to the first case study. I have chosen to present the example of Achelos River diversion project. Achelos River is a river flowing north-south direction from the northern mountains, you can see with the red color, from the northern mountains of the Pindus range to the Ionian Sea on your left-hand side below. And the diversion, the Achelos diversion project has been planned so as to remedy the agricultural and socioeconomic drought problem of the Thessaly plain, you can see on your right-hand side above, so as to remedy the agricultural and socioeconomic drought problems of the Thessaly region, where the farming communities of this region are facing agricultural and socioeconomic drought problems. On the other hand, the diversion project affects also the Ecological department, which is on your left-hand side below, and this is where most of the Achelos River basin is located. So there are two major regions affected. The Thessaly region on the one hand, and the Ecological department, where most of the Achelos basin is located, is the second region which is affected. Now, what is the objective of this case study here? First, to address the drought risk perceptions behind the project, and also to address, to identify the impacts of these risk perception, and of course of the diversion project, which has not been realized yet, at least completely. The impacts on the society, economy, and environment of both regions, the Thessaly region and the Ecological. I would like to, I didn't mention that Achelos River has been planned to be diverted into Pinios River, which is the river that crosses the Thessaly plain, and this is done for irrigation and other purposes. The project is a huge one, a complex and very expensive one. Some environmental organizations have characterized the project as a pharaonic one, and includes a series of infrastructure works: the construction of large dams, water reservoirs, water deviation tunnels, hydroelectric power stations, and an extensive irrigation and drainage system. So the project, this huge and complicated project, has attracted public attention and mass media attention for decades, and has caused disputes between proponents and opponents of the project, and mainly between the communities involved, those in the Ecological department on the one hand, and the region of Thessaly on the other, where the farmers expect benefits from diversion. And sign. You can see a sign saying freedom to the waters of Achelos. And you can see on your left-hand side some of the unfinished works of the Achelos of this project. Now, before identifying, before addressing the risk perceptions, I would like to refer in brief to the profile of the affected regions. First, the Dolokarnania region is an agricultural area. More than 50% of the population relies on agriculture. It is a relatively poor area, but at the same time, an area of high ecological value, particularly noted as a bird biotope. 3 out of the 11 wetlands of the country that are protected under the Ramsar Convention are located here, and among them, the Achelos Delta is among them. Achelos Delta is also protected as Natura area and as and also under the EU Bird Directive. As regards development priorities in Dolokarnania, except alternative forms of tourism, other priorities are livestock, fish and biological farming. But the problem is that water, especially the water of Achelos River, is essential for the sustainability of wetlands and economic viability of development activities. On the other hand, the Thessaly region, an agricultural region also, because agriculture represents more than 20% of the GDP, but with severe problems. I can mention some of them: dependence on cotton and other water-consuming cultivations, absence of products that are likely to be in demand in the future, water deficit, negligent water use, uncontrollable boring of aquifers and constant lowering of these aquifers, low percentage of irrigated land. However, Thessaly region, in the Thessaly region, the farming communities are politically powerful, populous and politically powerful. Now, this diagram presents, the stakeholders, the actors and stakeholders involved and affected by the diversion project. The blue rectangular, the smaller rectangular at the center of this diagram represents the local level. You can see schematically the diversion project, and you can read also, you can see the major actors and stakeholders at the local level. Regional and local authorities, environmental, regional and local organizations, social movements, the communities, the local communities, of course construction companies, and then we can move at a higher level, the national level, where predominant actors are the central government and government-controlled agencies, political parties, environmental NGOs, experts, and the mass media, but also important role at this level as the Council of State, because here it is where the appeals against the project are processed. And there are several appeals against the project. And we have at this level also the taxpayers who are called upon to contribute to the financing of the project. And at an even higher level, the international and European level, we have, of course, the European Commission, the international markets, who have an influence on the prices of agricultural products of the Thessaly region. And of course, the institutions that plan and exert climate change policies. Here on the front you can see a publicity poster for a protest rally against flooding of the village of Mismanagement as a result, a side effect of the diversion project. Now, let's address now the risk perceptions as reflected to the stance of the actors and stakeholders in favor or against the project. So we have on the one hand the actors supporting the project, on the other the actors opposing the project. In the first category, central government and government control organizations like the Public Power Corporation through their development rhetoric, local actors of Thessaly region and local mass media and constructions which lobby the government in favor of the project and which all these expect benefits from the diversion. I would like to stress here that the political influence, let's say, political cloud of Thessaly exceeds by far that of Ecological. And of course, we have the farming communities who perceive their own interest and of course their own agricultural and socioeconomic drought risk. On the other hand, among the actors opposing the project are the environmental NGOs and experts, those who can have a view of the threats to the environment, society and economy of Ecological. And of course local communities and actors in Ecological, such as local authorities, agricultural corporations, all these protesting time and again against the project. But as they are powerless, they have mostly to rely on the resources, on legal and technical resources of environmental organizations, especially in court appeals. Okay, before addressing the winners and losers out of the project, I would like to stress the fact that climate change has had an impact on Achelo's river water volume, of course, and that there is concern about the contribution that the river diversion can actually make to the water economy of Thessaly. Now, if I would like to present in brief the winners and losers out of the project, I could say that here we have an ecological system, that of the Syros river basin, which is somehow called upon to provide the natural capital for mitigation of agricultural and the socio-economic drought to which the farming communities in Thessaly region are exposed. The opposing argument, and of course the opposing risk perception, is that the natural resources necessary for this mitigation exist within the territory of Thessaly. Here, in a sense, we have a gigantic case of risk and vulnerability transference from one region to another, from the farmers and the agricultural economy of Thessaly to the eco-human system of Ecological and the taxpayers. And all this reminds us, of course, of the ripple effects as suggested by the social amplification of risk framework. I would like to say here that the Achelos diversion project has not been realized completely. We have some unfinished technical works, and currently it is again once more at the Council of State, where an appeal against the latest version of the diversion, because the latest version is a partial diversion. So there is an appeal against this partial diversion at the Council of State, and it is currently in process. So it may be the case that the Achelos diversion project won't realize at all. But there are several unfinished works, you can see on the image, which have already done a huge damage to the environment, and there is also a huge amount of money that has been spent for the purpose. I would like only to add that the initial diversion was for 1 billion cubic meters of water volume, while the partial diversion that is currently processing at the Council of State is for 250,000 million cubic meters. And now to the second case study. We've got time, could you please?
20 minutes or 15. 15 will be better, but 20 is great.
Okay. So, I hope. So, the second case study is about an insular region, the Dodecanese Islands, which constitute altogether a prefecture. The purpose of this case study is to address the risk perception on the drought risk perceptions in Dodecanese. The impact of these drought risk perceptions on the prevailing drought management solutions, and of course the final impact on the society, economy and the environment of this group of islands. First of all, a few words about the profile of the group, this insular region. Of course it is characterized by administrative and territorial fragmentation, development disparities, because we have on the one hand the high incomes and development standards of large islands like Rhodes, and on the other, the low development standards of small islands, those along the non-profit sea line, if you know, if I'm saying correctly the term. This group of islands is characterized also by water resource scarcity and fragile ecosystems. And the islands in the group can be classified in two categories: the arid ones, on the one hand, and those that are endowed with underground water resources. Now, regarding the prevailing water abstraction, procurement and consumption patterns in the Dodecanese, I think that these photos are eloquent. On the one hand, you can see traditional abstraction and consumption patterns, and on the photo on your left-hand side, you can see contemporary modes of water use. So indeed, changes in lifestyle in the course of time have changed both water availability perceptions and water demand, and have rendered traditional management practices obsolete. Those islands that are endowed with water resources are constantly bored, legally and illegally, for water, and arid islands are completely dependent on external water subsides, on transported water. The basic problem in certain of these Dodecanese islands is the unreliability of public water supply. And when I'm speaking about unreliability, I mean interruptions in water supply, low quality of water, and so on. This unreliability, in combination with poor monitoring and ignorance of water cycle data by municipal companies, creates a problem of knowledge confusion. And this knowledge confusion allows what I term as partial knowledges, which reflect conflicting interests of co-responsible actors. Indeed, in the Dodecanese Islands, we have the situation of very many and different partial knowledges of the drought problem and the appropriate drought management solutions. And these partial knowledges are carried by the authorities that are jointly responsible for water management. So, in a sense, a war has broken out among proponents and opponents of three categories of water management solutions. First, the solution of major infrastructure works. I mean here dams, reservoir, lakes, and so on. And this is basically favored by central ministries and construction interests. And it is the photo below is very eloquent to my view as to the way that these infrastructure works are constructed. So you can see a reservoir lake in Kalliopi, which should be constructed at the crossing of the water courses, but this is not the case at all. A second solution promoted by some responsible authorities is drillings, licensing always more and more water drillings, private water drillings. And this is basically favored by regional water authorities. And we have a third category of enforcement of always stricter water rates to coerce users towards water saving. This is a solution that is promoted mostly by municipal supply companies. And this is favored because of another reason, because in this solution, these municipal companies see also their economic viability. But the problem of knowledge confusion, which has led to partial knowledges, creates a confidence crisis on the part of the public. This means that people simply mistrust official views, and lack of faith in expert judgment in institutions undermine their role as competent drought managers. The result, the chain effect, in a sense, is that individuals and social groups place their confidence in their own intuitive science. And this reminds us of the cognitive heuristics of the psychometric party. They do also another thing. They enter into partnerships with real experts, but in a sense with simple speculators. And this situation opens a way, of course, to full privatization of water supply, because it reinforces suspect private networks which gradually obtain power and influence over the local community. Public institutions lose their clients and go bankrupt, and these private speculative networks become the leading actors in water management. The result, one of them, the results is the raising of the cost of water, of transported water, from 2.3 euros in 1997 to 11 euros in 2012, 2011 and 2012, which are years of the crisis period, I would like to remind you. The prevailing then drought mitigation practices are somehow evident and obvious. Intuitive knowledge and irrational individualized solutions to the water problem take the upper hand. Collective interest is sidestepped or abandoned, and long-term mitigation policies become impossible. The expensive public water and unreliable supply service actually function as an excuse for water users to maintain the practices of private, unmonitored, and often illegal water abstraction. And this is a situation that should not be characterized as a situation of a pluralist society with several views that should be negotiated. It is rather as a signal of a clientelistic fragmentation in a community, an indication of the prevailing individualistic mode of solving one's own problem. And this reminds us of the Douglas of the individualistic society as suggested by Mary Douglas. So, the ripple effects, licensed and unauthorized drillers get cheap water, speculate on demand, degrade public water quality, and raise the share of cost of public water consumers. Public water supply services lose clients and go bankrupt. Severe salinization is occurring in several locations because all users and all drainings are from the same aquifer. The islands are closed systems in this sense. So the hydrological system is constantly deteriorating. Arid islands, on the other hand, experience the constant increase of their vulnerability because of speculation on the part of private suppliers. And to the conclusions, or let's say messages, findings, or whatever. Risk perception is important for risk assessment and management because it determines whether a risk management policy can be accepted or not by the community it refers. Risk perceptions, we have seen already that risk perceptions of lay people are different from the objective risks of scientists. What is very important is that in the course of time, objective risks of experts become always less credible and risk perceptions always more important for risk management. And this is happening for several reasons. I would refer to some of them. For instance, historical data do not constitute anymore a credible base for projecting trends in the future and for anticipating future risks, especially those that are related to climate change. And experts are, when dealing with their objective risks, are faced with uncertainty. But even if a community could be knowledgeable of an objective risk, the decision about the part of this risk that should be eliminated by means, for instance, of mitigation measures, this decision should be a political one, could not be otherwise, because permitting dangerous activities, hazardous, risky activities, or prohibiting them, on the other hand, is a matter of exercise of political power. We have seen that information is important. We have seen it from the case studies for risk perception. But the information that is supplied, that is released by the mass media or the institutions may be biased, may serve specific interests, and may cause perceptual distortions. We have seen, for instance, the case of overvalued terrorism in contrast to the undervalued risks of heat wave, drought, and the forest fire. We have seen three basic epistemological approaches to risk perceptions: the psychological, the anthropological, sociological, and the interdisciplinary. The first elevated the heuristics and biases, the cognitive heuristics that people employ in their everyday life when they face risks, but not only then, also when they don't have risk information, or when this risk information is very complicated. We have seen the cultural theory of risks that offers a global taxonomy of different social structures corresponding to social roles and these to specific outlooks of risk. And we have seen this taxonomy as an attempt for explaining the differences in risk perception. The social amplification risk framework indicated that risk perceptions actually amplify or attenuate real, actual risks, and that they generate behaviors which have effect on the real risk itself. And we have seen the two case studies on the risk of drought, and we have seen the case of the Acheloos River diversion project, which was planned to remedy the agricultural and socio-economic drought of the farming communities of the Thessaly region. And this evidenced, to my view, that risk perceptions of powerful communities and groups and institutions tallying with their own interests dominate over the risk perceptions of the powerless, which in this case, in the Ecological river diversion case, suffer the impact of water deprivation due to the diversion. Of course, the project has not been realized, but we have seen severe damages up to now from unfinished works. The risk perceptions, in a sense, can act as triggering mechanisms for risk transfers from the powerful to the powerless. And among the powerless is the ecological systems, of course. And this transference, risk transference, refers to both relocation of risks and vulnerability from one place to another, and shifting of risk and vulnerability from one social group, one community to another. And I think this is the last, or almost the last slide. The Athens River diversion case confirms theoretical suggestions about the ripple effects of risk perceptions on the physical risk. We have seen also that because of risk perceptions and because of the risk of the ripple effects, we have not only transference of risk, but also transformation of risk. We have seen, for instance, the sociological and agricultural drought of Thessaly to transform to ecological drought risk for the environment of Ermoupolis, and hydrological drought risk. Finally, in the case of drought in the Dodecanese Islands, we have learned that not only community, groups and individuals, but also authorities can have risk perceptions and risk management perceptions, and this may conflict in one another. And in this case, confidence crisis is generated, which confidence crisis facilitates, opens the way to acceptance of water privatization, water supply privatization. So in this case, in the case of the Dodecanese, individualism in combination with lack of a common management perspective by the competent authorities has led to numerous partial knowledges. I have already mentioned that confidence crisis to public policies opens a way to privatization of water supply. In the end, legal and illegal private networks of water procurement and supply speculate on demand and transfer drought risk and vulnerability to lawful consumers, to low-income groups, and the hydrological system. As an ending remark, I could only say that under the circumstances, the only way out of the impasse is awareness of the value of credible credible risk information data, awareness of the value of collective knowledge processes, and integrated management solutions that treat water as a common environmental good and takes into account the capability of the hydrological and ecological system. Otherwise, the civil war on water that has already broken out in certain places will cancel any prospect for crisis management as well. Thank you for this.